Penn State's getting busy with its coaching search, and they're being pretty selective. Let's just say that Pat Kraft is not afraid to tell even a legit name no.
You are Locked On Nittany Lions, your daily podcast on the Penn State Nittany Lions. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked on to Penn State football, and as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Nittany Lions your first listen and watch every single day. My name is Zach Seyko, and I'm your host of the show, credentialed media member for both Penn State football and Penn State wrestling. On today's show, we are going to debate, should Penn State keep or cut Jim Knowles for next season? And does that have any influence on who Penn State ultimately hires as a head coach? Penn State's being particularly selective, and they are not afraid to tell even legit names, no, we don't think it's going to be a fit. We don't think it's going to work out. Urban Meyer, one of those names, we'll discuss it later on. But where do things stand? I'm going to go over a handful of candidates here that are standing out right now in Penn State's coaching search, which names you need to be aware of. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Friendly reminder to let me know your thoughts down in the comments section, as Penn State is leaving no stone unturned. There are going to be plenty of coaching candidates until this is actually finalized that are going to be in and out of the race for a variety of different reasons. But Penn State, this is why you're seeing so many different names linked to the job, because Pat Kraft is doing his due diligence and isn't afraid to say no. But we're going to focus on 5 of the main players here at this point in time. 5 of the biggest names, and so much can change, right? Days, weeks. But these are the 5 names, starting with Jeff Brohm over at Louisville. I've said in this coaching search that Penn State needs to get and find somebody different than James Franklin that has something that hasn't been present in State College for the better part of over a decade. And look no further than Jeff Brohm when it comes to big games, winning against ranked opponents and matching that threshold. So James Franklin and Penn State were winning the games that they were supposed to, winning the games that they were expected to, but they never took that step forward. Well, Jeff Brohm does that on a pretty consistent basis, may I add, while at, okay, well, he wasn't winning against top 5 opponents against Western Kentucky, but he was certainly shattering expectations and winning above that threshold at a place like Western Kentucky. Then goes to Purdue and picks up not 1, not 2, but 3 wins over top 5 opponents at Purdue during his time. And then this season at Louisville. It's his alma mater. We'll talk about that in just a second here. But you want a coach that does not coach scared in big games, that knows what it takes to win. Jeff Brohm's your guy. Brohm's 4-4 in matchups against top 5 opponents, with a more recent win over Ohio State than James Franklin, 2018 at Purdue. Defeated number 2 Iowa in 2021 as Purdue's head coach. And then in that same season, picked up a win against Michigan State. So 2 top 5 wins in 2021 for Purdue. And then this season as it currently stands, they defeated number 2 Miami and sent that team in a downward spiral. Louisville can say that we messed up the Hurricane season. So Jeff Brohm knows how to win against top-tier opponents. Against top 10 opponents, 5-7 overall. Okay, it's not, 500 record against top 5 is nothing to bat an eye at. 5-7 against top 10 opponents. Okay, still very respectable. And then 12-17 against top 25. So there is consistent success across the board for Jeff Brohm-led teams. And for comparison, let's talk about James Franklin's record. 1-15 against top 5 opponents. 4-21 against top 10 opponents. 15-30 against top 25 opponents. It doesn't even compare. If you want something different from James Franklin, what Penn State has been for a decade plus, you go and get Jeff Brohm. It's going to be difficult to pry him away from his alma mater, but he is a top candidate and there is mutual interest. The second candidate that I want to bring up, and maybe things have cooled down since Georgia Tech was upset by NC State this past weekend. But Brent Key, according to 24/7 Sports, the Penn State affiliate site, is reporting that Brent Key, during his bye week with Georgia Tech, is set to have an interview with Pat Kraft and Penn State. So Penn State is getting busy. Penn State is very busy with this head coaching search, and Georgia Tech losing like that, a little bit of distraction because Brent Key, right? The report that he's going to interview with Penn State. With that being said, Brent Key, just despite losing this game to NC State, that's not a game that you're supposed to lose. They were top 10. That is an upset, and it's unexcusable. However, Brent Key is still an extremely impressive head coach so far. Getting the first chance to be a full-time head coach, and he has turned Georgia Tech around. Georgia Tech was abysmal for the past, give or take, 4 or 5 years, and then Brent Key stabilizes that program and has them around the top of the ACC in year 2 as the head coach. This is a guy that I would like for Penn State because he's proven that he can have instant success. But then the second part of that equation, guy just emphasizes physicality, being tough, though that's his core tenet. And that works very well in the Big Ten. So it's no wonder, because the ACC, I don't think of them as a physically dominant, a physical conference. And Brent Key has established that if Georgia Tech's going to be anything, they're going to be physical. Well, he would bring that same sentiment to Penn State. And that's what I would like. Something else that you and I will appreciate about Brent Key is that he is a former assistant coach under Nick Saban. You will never see college football never have enough of Nick Saban disciples running around. So it's understandable why Brent Key is having the success that he has. But Key, an offensive line guy, an offensive-minded head coach, somebody that emphasizes physicality, that belongs in the Big Ten. If Penn State were to go in that direction, now that's not my preferred candidate, but I still like Brent Key as a candidate. I think that would be a plus hire. There's upside there. He uses the transfer portal very well. It is difficult for schools like Georgia Tech because of academics to be able to navigate NIL and the transfer portal, and Brent Key has figured out how to do that and make Georgia Tech a serious player here. Again, the concern with any of these teams that we were going to talk about, or any of these coaches at these specific schools, the college football playoff. So Penn State, are they going to be patient, or are they going to try to make a move to get a head coach as soon as possible with the transfer portal, with recruiting? Speaking of teams in a good position to get to the college football playoff. Yes, Mike Elko. Mike Elko of Texas A&M. Oh, there's no chance that I'm not here to say that it's likely. I'm also here to say that it is not impossible either. Mike Elko has connections to the Northeast. You can make the argument that maybe it's his dream job. He's from New Jersey. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. So he's somewhat of a Pennsylvania guy. I'm not here to say that he's miserable at Texas A&M. He has every resource that he could ever ask for and then some. And it's going to be difficult, especially if they continue to have this kind of success. And Texas A&M is going to want to back him up and say, you deserve to be rewarded here. We don't want to be looking for a head coach. But Mike Elko is a name that is still worth mentioning because of his connections to the Northeast. And yes, Brian Hartline. Brian Hartline, offensive coordinator of Ohio State, put on a pretty nice in-person interview this past Saturday. I am somewhat kidding about that. No, but Pat Kraft being on the sideline and watching Ohio State's offense go to work against Penn State, and I know Penn State doesn't compare to the years past, and it shouldn't have been an expectation for them to keep that game as close as they did. But Brian Hartline as somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience. That's the huge concern with Hartline, is that he doesn't have enough. He hasn't been a full-time play caller for very long. He's not, he doesn't have any head coaching experience. Okay, well, neither did Kirby Smart, neither did Dan Lanning, neither did Marcus Freeman. They are not the standard. They are all the exception, but you don't get head coaching experience until you become a head coach. And I think Penn State, it is worth taking a chance on Brian Hartline, who can be the head coach. Get him a staff that complements his strengths, because you want his recruiting. You want his ability to develop players and what he would be able to. You want to talk about bringing something different to State College. Penn State would have exactly that, because Penn State has not had that kind of muscle when it comes to recruiting. Brian Hartline does, playing in the NFL for quite some time. His continued development, and it's not just consistent. Oh, he sends wide receivers to the NFL. He sends a guaranteed first-round pick to the NFL at wide receiver. You want that in State College if you're Pat Kraft and Penn State. And the final name that is going to be worth mentioning here is Manny Diaz. And Manny Diaz is, succeeding at Duke, and what a win against Clemson. To go to be gutsy, to pull off that close victory, outcoach Dabo Swinney and former Penn State defensive coordinator Tom Allen. Manny Diaz, though, it would be interesting to bring him back, because I feel like that is somewhat of a continuation of the James Franklin era to an extent. Manny Diaz is a much better X's and O's coach. You would get his defensive system back, which is a plus. But Manny Diaz, my question about him is recruiting. And while Duke is starting to claw its way back in the ACC, it's not like it's Georgia Tech and Louisville where they are at the top. Duke is trying to fight its way back to make sure that they can get into the conference championship. So it's an uphill battle for Duke. So Manny Diaz, because of that, he's a mutual of Pat Kraft. They are no strangers to each other. There is a prior working relationship. So Diaz might find his way back to State College if he continues to overcome that uphill battle at Duke. But I want to mention him, not my favorite again, but it's not a bad hire. It's not an awful hire, just not my preferred one at this point in time. All right. So Penn State, again, I could talk about a handful of other names. One name that I do want to talk about is Urban Meyer, because, the allure of Meyer getting back into the coaching game. Penn State should want him, right? He's won national titles. The reports say that Penn State flat out told him no. What does that mean? Coming up next, we're going to talk about that next here on Locked On Nittany Lions. And this episode is brought to you by Gametime. We all love college football. The tailgates, the rivalries, the energy in the stands, there's just nothing like it. But let's be real. Actually getting tickets can feel more like a battle than the game itself. Endless queues, hidden fees, prices jumping at checkout. That's why you got to use Gametime, the app that gives the advantage back to the fans. It's the easiest way to score last-minute tickets at the best prices with no surprise fees. What you see is what you pay. You can pull up Gametime, and in just a couple of taps, you'll see amazing deals. I'm talking about your favorite college football games for as low as $25. And if you've never used Gametime before, there's an awesome feature where if you've never been to a venue, if you've never been to a stadium, you get to see your point of view from your selected seats ahead of time. So there's no second guessing yourself about which seats that you choose for the game. So take the guesswork out of buying college football tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that is promo code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Gametime today. Still to come in this episode, we are going to talk about whether or not Penn State should keep Jim Knowles as its defensive coordinator next season, and why that actually might affect who Penn State's hiring as its next head coach. But we got to pick back up with Urban Meyer being linked to the Penn State head coaching job, and the rumor that Penn State actually told him no. And it's actually being a little misconstrued, not by everybody, but I'm going to give you the correct interpretation here. So Urban Meyer, let's start from the most recent series of events where Urban says that he did not have a desire to return to college coaching. And then he praised Brian Hartline in the process as being ready to be a head coach. And Urban, I agree with you, actually. I think that Brian Hartline would be a phenomenal hire. Again, if you're not going to get Mike Elko, logistics aside, objectively speaking, Mike Elko, I think, would be the best candidate for Penn State. So if you can't get him and you got to pivot to somebody like Brian Hartline, or you can't get any of those other head coaching candidates that I named, yeah, I think I'm willing for Penn State to take the risk on a coach like Brian Hartline. I digress from that. But Urban, I'm going to stay in retirement. Okay. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Zach Gelb, he's a radio host for the Infinity Sports Network. He went on his talk show and said that he had conversations with two different sources that said that Urban had great interest in the Penn State job and had conversations with the powers that be at Penn State. But when it came to NIL, there was a disconnect. Okay. Some people are interpreting that as Meyer didn't feel good about where Penn State stood on the NIL front. If you see anybody saying that or trying to suggest that, they are either being disingenuous or they are just flat out wrong and they don't know. They don't know what's going on. They don't know how that conversation went. The correct way to interpret this is that Urban Meyer did not have the correct answers and did not give Penn State that confidence that he would be able to navigate a college football program through this era of NIL and the transfer portal. And you got to imagine that is going to be a massive deal for Pat Kraft and Penn State, because the university and the people, the administration right now, led by Pat Kraft, the sports administration and the people that care on all fronts, they believe that this season did not work the way that it did because Penn State wasn't maximizing. James Franklin wasn't maximizing NIL and the transfer portal. The rumors that were swirling that Penn State wanted to be more aggressive in the portal and James Franklin didn't, or in NIL and high school recruiting. Again, these are rumors. It's he said, she said, it's hearsay, but it's still a concern. So if that's the case, from Kraft's point of view, he's going to want to make sure that whatever coach they are going to bring in knows how to utilize the transfer portal, knows how to be strategic, and is not afraid to use resources in the NIL sphere. And Urban Meyer, who's been out of the college football game since that change, he hasn't coached college football since 2018. Massive changes have occurred. So while Urban Meyer, I still think, is one of the best football minds out there, would he actually be one of the best head coaching candidates on the board? I wouldn't mind him as a consultant. I wouldn't mind him as a source of information for Penn State. So say that's Brian Hartline, and then you bring in Urban Meyer as somebody that's just an influence on how to still run a college football program. But when it comes to navigating this new landscape of college football, Urban Meyer might not be your guy anymore. So I've said that, hey, maybe Florida and Meyer could figure out a follow-up and come to an agreement. Maybe that's what's best for that side. But Penn State, they told Urban Meyer no. And I have a hunch. This is not, do not take this as journalism and reporting. This is, I want to clarify that this is my opinion. I've said this a couple other times now, but I am led to believe that Pat Kraft and Penn State had told someone like Matt Rule no. Rule was absolutely it was 100%, 110% interested in returning to his alma mater. And then, a couple of results happen. They lose to Minnesota. Okay, now he signed the contract extension, but you better believe, let's just put two and two together. You absolutely better believe that Matt Rule was interested in returning to Penn State with the head coaching job opening, a prior relationship with Pat Kraft. And this is what I respect about Kraft, is that he's putting relationships aside and saying, I got to do what's best for the university and what's best for this job, because my career is on the line if I get this wrong. Rule was absolutely interested in the Penn State head coaching job. And that's why the odds were so high by different odds makers saying, hey, this is who is going to be the next head coach of Penn State. A lot of Penn State fans were disappointed at the end of the day. I think Penn State would have been able to give the support and the resources to Matt Rule to make him better and help him succeed. But that's not always the case, as we've just seen with James Franklin. And that's just it. When we have these head coaching conversations, it's about what can somebody bring that is different to Penn State and Happy Valley. Matt Rule, I don't know that, and I do know, let me clarify, I do know that he wouldn't bring much that is different from the past regime with what Franklin had done. Sure, Matt Rule is a different coach in his own right, the way that he operates. I think he would bring different, the different mentality and the way that he would approach X's and O's, but it's not translating onto the football field. So again, Penn State has struggled with the transfer portal. They've struggled in NIL. They've struggled in big games. Matt Rule checks those same boxes. If you're Penn State, you don't want any of that. So that's why Brent Key and Jeff Brohm are so appealing, because they win, in regard to Brohm, win the big games. In regard to Brent Key, he knows how to maximize the transfer portal at a school like Georgia Tech. Imagine if you gave him the resources that Penn State has to succeed. But Urban Meyer, being told no, a legacy name, one of the best coaches in college football history, and Penn State says, no, we're good. That is extremely telling about Penn State. They are being selective. They know that they have all the chips. They hold all the cards in this coaching search. And even as a job like Auburn. So I was wrong to say that, hey, Penn State needs to speed things up. They are not concerned when it comes to LSU, Florida, Auburn, anybody else. They don't see them as competition. Penn State is doing its own thing. They are dictating the coaching market. More power to Pat Kraft and the university right now, because they believe that they're the best coaching job on the market and they're acting like it. And I got to agree at this point. I was a little nervous when some of those other high profile jobs came open. Doesn't matter. Penn State's going to get its preferred candidate one way or another after they do their due diligence. Sticking with this conversation about coaches and who should be at State College and who shouldn't be, Jim Knowles, he's not a head coaching candidate, but would Penn State consider retaining him to be a defensive coordinator? I have an update from a source that I want to share, but also my opinion about it as well. That's coming up next here on Locked On Nittany Lions. And this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA is back, and there's no better place to get in on the action than with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or you want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score next to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can combine your live bets into a same game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets. That's right, $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And you can use that on anything across FanDuel. NFL football, NBA basketball, college football. Lines are available for Penn State versus Indiana. Penn State is at home, but they are an underdog. Indiana is favored by 14.5 points, minus 580 on the money line, plus 420 if you're thinking Penn State. The total is set at 48.5 for this game coming up this Saturday. If you like those lines, you can bet them over at FanDuel.com or the FanDuel app. And remember, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Head over to FanDuel.com to sign up and play your game with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Final segment on the show, keep or cut Jim Knowles. And this is where I would appreciate your feedback and your comments down below. Jim Knowles. Well, some people say this was a terrible experiment. It was expensive. Get him out of town. Then there's somewhat of a strategic way to manage the Jim Knowles situation. This guy is still universally respected amongst the college football world. I understand Penn State fans and Ohio State fans that say, oh, good riddance, he was no good. The The guy was your defensive coordinator and had the #1 defense at Ohio State last season and helped you win a national championship. All right. Knowles did not become one of the worst defensive coordinators in all of college football overnight. There are serious personnel issues, and it's not meshing right now. And that is part of the reason why Franklin is no longer employed, because when it came to winning now in a season that you needed to make the postseason, and you go for a hire that short term, yeah, hindsight's 2020, but short term, might not have been the best when Penn State was in win now mode. But to rebuild and to get a Jim Knowles defense peaking at the right time to really make a playoff push, different circumstances. Again, hindsight's 2020, but you go and get a defensive coordinator. If you go and get a defensive coordinator like Jim Knowles, you need to find a way to keep him if it makes sense. Okay. So let's give an example here. If Brian Hartline happens to become the next head coach, well, there you go. Your defensive coordinator is practically taken care of for him. They have a working prior relationship. That would make a ton of sense. But if it came to a coach like Mike Elko or Manny Diaz, and this is where it could complicate things, because do these candidates want Jim Knowles as their pre-selected defensive coordinator? I don't know. I can't speak on their behalf. If I'm an established head coach and I have something that's working for me, I'm going to want to bring most of my staff members with me. So this is the thing that's kind of complex about Penn State's head coaching search, is that you have figures like Terry Smith, Deion Barnes, Dan Connor, Jim Knowles, all of them. So this conversation is primarily about Jim Knowles because he has such a prominent role as the #2 guy on the staff, essentially being the defensive coordinator. Okay, you can make the argument for OC or even Terry Smith as an associate head coach, now turned interim head coach. But all of these assistants that are on staff, you would like to find a way to retain them. I'm not saying it's a guarantee and that you shouldn't push away an ideal head coaching candidate just because you want to retain the services of these other coaches. However, you have to find maybe some balance here, because even though Jim Knowles has not been the best in year one, you don't tell an elite defensive coordinator and one of the best defensive minds in all of college football to get out of town just like that. Have some discussions, see if a head coach would be willing to take him on as a defensive coordinator. So I'm eager to see how Penn State is approaching this. According to one source that I've spoken to, the preference is for Jim Knowles to stay in State College. That's just, again, this is one source that is saying this, but it's understandable. You make this investment, you have the contract, you just fired James Franklin. You're going to have to fire probably Andy Kotelnicki after, and I know I had that conversation recently here after the Ohio State game about what do you do? Do you need to fire more head coaches? More firings are coming. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And Andy Kotelnicki, Marcus Hagans, and Danny O'Brien are the names that are going to first come to mind. What I'm getting at is that don't expect Jim Knowles to be grouped into that same conversation, that it's not going to be a total clean house, total reset type of situation here. I think Penn State wants to combine what it has and then allow that head coach to come in and benefit from what James Franklin couldn't, and what other prospective coaching candidates, while linked to Penn State, probably wouldn't be able to either. There's a way to balance this. If you get Manny Diaz, let's just for an example, or again, Mike Elko, they're probably going to want a different defensive coordinator, and that's understandable. And I don't blame them if they happen to let Jim Knowles go. But it's not worth it. I'm here to say that it is not worth to push him out just because, for the sake of it. You can keep Jim Knowles and actually benefit from it, because then he will be in year 2 in his defensive system. But then what is the roster outlook? Which players are going to stay? That also complicates it as well, because then you're kind of starting the 3-year process over. If you can keep a good amount of the defensive roster, Mari Campbell, Tony Rojas return, Chaz Coleman, I'm just here to name some of the first names that come to mind. And then you get other players that are going to complement Jim Knowles' defense and be able to continue to build off of it, then yeah, you want to keep him because it actually benefits the team. But if a head coach wants to go in a different direction, or you're in a situation where, hey, we got to start the clock all over again, I understand it. So it's a 50-50 setup right now, whether or not Penn State actually keeps or cuts Jim Knowles. Let me just say at this point in time, based on what I've heard, that the preferred route is to keep him. But time will tell ultimately what happens here with Jim Knowles. You can make the most of it. You can actually benefit from keeping him, but it also makes sense if you let him go at the end of the day and don't keep him as your defensive coordinator. That is going to do it for this edition of Locked On Nittany Lions. Appreciate each and every one of you for checking out this episode. If you are new to the show, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel and wherever you get your podcasts so you do not miss any episodes around all your favorite Penn State sports teams. We talk about football, wrestling, basketball, hockey, recruiting, you name it. It is all right here on Locked On Nittany Lions.